consultations take place. And also the outcomes of these consultations tend to only partially inform the VNRs, if they actually inform the VNRs at all. And also these types of consultations rarely are translated into broader, more stable spaces for participatory policymaking and or monitoring. So all these different institutional points, elements tends to lead us to assert that the effects that the SDGs have had on institutional innovation, for example, or in changing political practices or in expanding public deliberation processes has been quite limited up to now. Regarding more policy-related aspects, one element that is widespread throughout the world at any given time is that, and that's very highlighted in the scorecards, is that there's still a substantial gap between policy environments and actual implementation. So there is a widespread perception, that relatively positive perception around policy environments being conducive to sustainable development, at least to some extent. But there is still a very large gap regarding actual implementation of these policy frameworks. And also integrated and systemic approaches, this integration ethos that is very much front and center of the SDGs. These approaches tend to be only discursive or superficial, especially at a policymaking, from a policymaking standpoint. Regarding monitoring, it has to be said that most countries do provide a baseline of data, but there are still many challenges regarding data availability, that is, regarding data generation, but also the extent of data disaggregation that is available in each country, but also regarding transparency, that is how the data is actually generated and how the data actually informs policymaking and decision-making processes. Related to the fact that is still quite substantial gap regarding actual policy implementation, in recent years, we also have seen a reduction regarding means of implementation and financing for the SDGs, which is currently related, of course, to the growing global inflationary context brought by the rising interest rate worldwide that were a consequence of the lingering effects of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, etc. But also, this is an element that stems from the fact, and it's exacerbated actually by the fact that there are still asymmetries and inequities that are built into the global financial architecture that haven't been properly addressed still, even though there have been some interesting ideas that have been introduced, like especially regarding innovative ways to use the special drawing rights in order to increase financial flows for countries in the global south, or also regarding debt sustainability frameworks, etc. These still are far from being implemented substantially and ambitiously, which is what is needed at this point. So all this leads us to say that there's still limited demonstrable progress in the transformative potential of the 2030 agenda, but you'll be able to find more insight and data both on the People's Scorecard Summary Report for 2022 and also on the Progressing National SDG Implementation Report, which is this civil society-led report that analyzes both VNRs and spotlight reports. Next slide, please. So quickly, the support that we actually provide for national civil society assessments. Every year we support around 20 national coalitions in every region in the world and in Europe on a voluntary basis. Our website hosts a wide range of CSO reports from every year since 2016, plus summary reports for the People's Scorecard. And of course, we really view this global movement in the independent assessment as a key opportunity to not only produce independent insights on the state of play regarding the SDG implementation process, but also to connect from the local to the national, to the regional, and to the global level, of course. And the idea this year is to try to build a global assessment based on civil society collective perceptions on the level of progress in SDG implementation. Next slide, please. Thank you. And regarding the actual approach that we'll be prioritizing this year. First, you should know that normally the People's Scorecard focuses on an assessment on the depth and scope of the implementation process. So it's an assessment that encompasses the different dimensions that actually constitute the implementation process. So to what extent policy environments are conducive to sustainable development, the level and scope of institutional capacities that are made available by each government in order to support the SDG implementation process, but also the level and extent of inclusiveness and participation that are embedded within the different implementation processes around the world. But this year, since 2023 marks the halfway point in the implementation process, we will aim to take stock of tangible progress on SDG implementation in each country. So the scorecard approach will actually focus on assessing the perception from civil society in each country around the actual results of the implementation process for each SDG, and at an aggregated level for the SDG framework as a whole, and not so much on the process. Next slide, please. So regarding the People's Scorecard steps, let's say constitutive steps. The first one, of course, is to form a broad CSO coalition, if there isn't one already in place, in order to bring the widest possible array of perspectives into the independent assessment. Also, to conduct a survey, both online and or in person, based on the People's Scorecard template, in order to gather perceptions around the level of progress in each of the SDGs, with a scale that goes from -5 to +5, which actually allows respondents to convey whether they perceive backsliding or positive progress into the implementation process. And also, we encourage our national partners for the spotlight reports to actually try to assess the quality of the national implementation process through a set of guiding questions that we actually also provide with the People's Scorecard template. And also convene dialogues, both at the national and subnational level, if possible, trying to focus on historically marginalized communities in any given national context in order to gather their views and also their specific demands that can then be conveyed through the spotlight reports. And also try, hopefully, to have follow-up activities in order to build on the scorecard and spotlight report findings and results in order to further advance advocacy efforts post-VNR, post-HLPF. Next slide, please. So this is the set of scorecard countries for 2023. As you can see, we have 6 countries in Africa, 6 in Asia, 2 in the MENA region, 5 in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is actually 4 of them are actually follow-up countries that will produce follow-up spotlight reports and hopefully also follow-up scorecards. And also a voluntary country in Europe that will hopefully also contribute a scorecard this year. So, okay, thank you very much.
Excellent, Nicolas, and thank you for that very comprehensive and clear overview of the kinds of support that we have been providing and the ways that different coalitions can work to hold their governments to account. We know that it's different for each country, and of course, it's very much driven by the needs and the demands of each coalition in each country to understand the best way to raise your concerns and put those on the table with government. So we look forward to hearing more in just a little while from some of those key country examples from this year. But now to complete the picture and to give us some further insights on the VNR process, I'm very pleased that we have Josefina Villegas from CPDE to talk us through some of their findings. Over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Oli. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this collective discussion on our engagement with the HLPF process, civil society organizations. So from my end, I am hoping I will be able to contribute to this discussion with some preliminary findings from our VNR study for 2023. This is a study we conduct on a yearly basis. And usually we develop a survey. Actually, we work with the same survey, but we revisit this survey every year to see if there's anything that we need to add or change or modify. For instance, in the past years, we've included some questions regarding the COVID-19 pandemic response. And for this year in particular, we've added some questions related to this halfway point, right? We are all facing right now in terms of the Agenda 2030 implementation process. But our report is usually finalized by HLPF itself. So this is why we're talking about preliminary findings. The report is still in the process of being developed. So you're getting a first glimpse of the outcomes, and they are quite, they resonate a lot with what Nicolas has just presented, actually. So it seems like people on the ground have a very similar perspective on how implementation of the SDGs is going. So to start off this quick presentation, just some quick notes on our methodology. The CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness works around the effective development cooperation principles. We, as civil society organizations, work collectively in a global platform, global South-led platform, for upholding these principles as the main drivers for development and sustainable development. EDC is a framework, as it says here in the slide, that seeks to shape and align development programs and policies to ensure that all stakeholders, especially those belonging to the marginalized sectors, are involved in the process of addressing structural causes of poverty, inequality, and social marginalization. So these 4 principles are country ownership of development priorities, the need for inclusive partnerships to conduct development that's actually works for all and not just for a few, a clear focus on results, and transparency and accountability or shared responsibility. So our survey is structured around these 4 principles. And what we ask the organizations responding this survey is, how do you perceive the VNR reporting process from these principles' perspectives? And there's different questions under each of these principles. So we're not directly asking on concrete progress on specific SDGs, but more on, so is country ownership part of your, how do we assess country ownership in relation to the VNR process and Agenda 2030 implementation? And the same for inclusive partnerships, focus on results, and transparency and accountability. Next slide, please. So the way we do this since 2018, actually, is we developed this survey. Our process is completely online. There is no in-person surveys conducted. And we share this survey with our members, and we also encourage our members to share it with other organizations. So we try to reach as many organizations as possible. These organizations vary in their nature. So some are national coalitions, and some are individual organizations, local grassroots organizations. It varies. And we try to additionally do some research through our regional focal points to bring in as many organizations from the VNR reporting countries as possible. So we look at the list of countries that are reporting every year, and we try to see if there's any gaps where maybe there's some countries where we don't have any members, and we try to bring in perspectives from those organizations as well. This is a comparison of our kind of like, data collection process throughout the years. You will notice that there's a big gap between 2021 and 2023. We changed our methodology in the middle because in 2021, we got a high rate of responses, but a large percentage of this came from the same country. So we noted that depending on how the survey was being conducted, this could lead to some biases. So last year we adjusted, and this year we managed to get the same amount of responses, but from a very much diverse amount of countries. 65 countries are represented in our survey this year, out of which 19 are VNR reporting countries for this year HLPF. And we also got 109 responses. Of course, this doesn't provide any sort of exhaustive, let's say, baseline for the outcome. But we do consider that it's quite representative of civil society perspectives from the ground. And hopefully every year we will be able to bring in more perspectives. Next slide, please. So just at a glance, and I think I'm gonna have to cut short the presentation because it might be a bit long. These are our main conclusions, let's say, from each of the principles. So for country ownership, we tried to look into, I'm switching to my own presentation here where I have my own notes. For country ownership, we tried to look into how SDG strategies are integrated into national planning and implementation. And we see from the responses that 84% of the countries have adopted SDG strategies into their national development planning, yet most are still ineffective. How do we measure ineffectiveness? Well, we have a quarter of CSO report, only a quarter of CSOs report satisfactory implementation in terms of the process, because many governments are still lacking follow through or fail to cascade strategies within their governance structures or even towards the local level. We're also trying to assess if there are local reports happening, local voluntary reports happening. Or there's also a lack of implementation of mechanisms for collective accountability. So for inclusive partnerships, over 70% of respondents indicate that there is now some sort of stakeholder mechanism in place. However, 3/4 suffer from disabling conditions to engage those mechanisms, such as bureaucratic red tape, disabling policies, or no access to funding. So this is kind of similar, right? We have institutional mechanisms in place, but still it ends up being superficial, and there's limited involvement of civil society organizations. Furthermore, the usual obstacles that hindered CSO engagement prior to the SDGs still persist. Inadequate financial support, limited information sharing, or the information comes out of time, bureaucratic challenges, and legal constraints. In transparency and accountability, we've seen some progress. CSOs report that data is being made available more data is being made available. Yet this data does not seem to be completely pertinent or useful or complementary to CSO work on the ground. So there is still quite a lot of work that could be done there to make CSOs' efforts also work better and produce better synergies with government's efforts towards implementing the Agenda 2030. And in terms of a focus on results, well, similar barriers and gaps persist, especially related to CSO involvement, low awareness of the SDGs, and a lack of consultations with marginalized and vulnerable groups. Now, moving on to the next slide, we wanted to kind of like zoom into this because this is actually our biggest conclusion, I think, from this year's report, and it's not a happy conclusion, unfortunately, but it's that the SDGs midway into Agenda 2030 deadline have not significantly contributed to addressing the issues of marginalized and vulnerable groups. So this resonates with what Nicolas was saying in terms of, well, the targeted policy interventions are still insufficient, right? And we're still not seeing the results on the ground. So despite relative progress on other principles, findings reveal that the impact on the ground remains largely unchanged. And SDG implementation has primarily raised awareness on social issues rather than effectively lifting people out of poverty. So from, I guess that this is our main conclusion. Government efforts not halfway into the SDG implementation failed to match the level of ambition set in 2016. Of course, we had COVID pandemic in the middle, and there's the entire context. But as also mentioned by Nicholas, I think there are some systemic causes, which are also the root cause on why this is happening. And we think that at this time, then we're also going to have the SDG summit in September, is a very important moment to raise our voices around this. If we move on to the next slide, I would like to ask maybe Oli, how much more time I have, because it's a bit long. I can try to go through it quickly. 1 more minute? Okay, so let's just slide through them. So next slide. Similarly to what was mentioned before, 84% of countries have SDG strategies, yet only a quarter of these are effective. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of inclusive partnerships, we've asked our members and the respondents of our survey, so how are these partnerships being conducted? And these are the different aspects of these questions, right? So the structure of the consultation has allowed us to participate in the sections of the VNR. These are the different challenges actually for the partnerships themselves. There's lack of information regarding SDG implementation, lack of resources towards participation, bureaucratic challenges, or red tape in CSO participation, different priorities as an organization, or others. Moving on, I think that, sorry, the one before that, this is the main outcome, and I think this is the most alarming, that out of 110 CSOs, actually 109, this needs to be updated, only 17 have successfully integrated recommendations to their country's VNRs. For the rest, it's only the shadow reports, and those reports have not been successfully included into the official reports. And I think this speaks for itself, right? It's been already 7 years, and governments still do not include CSO perspectives comprehensively into the report, as if it was not civil society organizations, the ones on the front line addressing main challenges and problems out of unsustainable development. So moving on to the next slide. I'll just skip this because it's a bit more complex. For transparency and accountability, as I was mentioning, it is encouraging to see that there are more mechanisms for reporting and providing data and information, yet these need to be more useful for civil society to contribute to progress in SDG implementation, and for these efforts to create synergies. Next slide. And in terms of a focus on results, well, I think I've already mentioned the biggest part. It was quite surprising for us that this year we got very similar results to last year, meaning there hasn't been a lot of progress. So this is the positive impacts, right? And we compare this to last year responses, and it remains pretty much the same. There's been no increase in more funds being allocated to SDG priorities, or greater efforts to promote gender equality or gender sensitive budgets, greatest awareness of SDGs at the local level, etc. Moving on, these are the main barriers. Government budget allocations are not aligned with SDG priorities. There is low awareness regarding SDGs among implementers at the national level. There is low awareness regarding SDGs among implementers at the local level. CSOs are not sufficiently consulted, and other relevant stakeholders are not sufficiently engaged. So the next slides are just our overarching demands or conclusions. Yeah, it's only 2. I will just read the main points. If we can go back to the previous one quickly. For us, resource mobilization is the focus of the halfway point to the SDGs. Still, this, of course, needs to be taking CSO participation into account, and including all of our demands related to official development assistance. Our focus on results, accountability, and inclusive partnerships should be the main driving force for implementing the 2030 agenda. And lastly, to truly aspire to leave no one behind, we need to uphold solidarity in the forms of grants over loans. There needs to be an institutionalization of the participation and inclusion of CSOs through dedicated mechanisms and frameworks. There needs to be an urgent provision of access to essential services to vulnerable and marginalized groups. And I need to adhere to transparent, measurable, and time-bound frameworks for assessing progress and results. Thank you. I hope that was not so much information. And sorry for taking a little bit more of time for the discussion.
Thanks so much, Josefina. I think that's very, very useful. And hopefully people will have seen that there's some trends between what Nicolas has pointed out and what Josefina also included. For example, it seems that governments are willing to talk about the importance of leaving no one behind, and they make mention of that in the VNRs, but there's very limited implementation of policies that actually deliver on the principles of leaving no one behind and actually reach those furthest behind. So there's clearly a gap between the kind of the language and the rhetoric that's often used in the VNRs and what really happens on the ground in so many countries. It's also interesting, I think, to note that in some of your presentations, you've highlighted that the data is still quite limited. So countries will cover some elements of data, but not other elements. And having that more comparable and accountable data is so important. We know that the UN has set out guidelines on how governments should measure, but it's a voluntary review. And so we face a challenge where governments can still pick and choose which elements of data they want to cover and which of the goals they want to focus on. So there's some big gaps, but hopefully working together, we can keep up that momentum and put some pressure on different governments. So before we go into the country examples, we have a few minutes still to hear any questions, any observations. If anyone who's with us, if you'd like to either put your question in the chat or if you use the hand raise function at the bottom of your screen, we should also be able to hear you if you would like to make a comment or a question to either of the two panelists you've heard so far. Or any comments coming through on the chat, please feel free. Let me see if we have anything in the Q&A. Nothing right now, apart from a greeting from Iris at Unitas in Bolivia. Great to have you here. Anyone who would like to raise their hand? I see we have one, Zebis Mumba from Zambia, I believe. Welcome, good to have you here. I wonder if somebody could help to unmute Zebis to enable him to be able to speak. Okay, Zebis, you should be able to unmute yourself now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Oli and colleagues. I think I just got touched with what Josefina shared regarding the CSOs that have had their perspectives added onto the national voluntary national review framework. So maybe going forward, really, this is quite unfortunate, and maybe as CSOs, we could be helped to understand maybe how can we change this scenario, because we know that in most cases, I think consultation is not too good in terms of government CSO consultations, but also the collaboration that is existing might still be not very coherent. So how do we, from our side as CSOs, I think, how do we really look at sharpening this integration? Because this is a very key level in terms of participation of the CSOs, more especially that with our perspectives missing, then it means we have got very limited approaches that maybe states can feel we are able to contribute effectively. So I think the question of how can we change this narrative, this scenario, maybe is the raising of my hand in terms of ideas. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Zebis. And we have a similar question from Puteri around how do we identify why governments actually integrate CSO inputs into their report. So I think, yeah, both questions here are really focusing on how do we ensure that we get those voices from civil society to be recognized in the reports. I don't know, Josefina, perhaps you'd like to go first, and then we can come back to Nicolas.
Sure. So I'll go with the second question first, just in terms of, because the question is how to identify that the government has integrated CSOs in their report, right? Among the 17 countries, I guess. So for civil society organizations that report that their own reports or their own vision have been included into the VNRs, these are civil society organizations, national coalitions usually, that are very much involved in the VNR reporting process, and they are part of the process itself entirely. So from the initial consultations to the drafting, to the monitoring, to even the reporting at the UN. And this is how they know that their perspectives have been integrated. Now, in terms of how to improve this percentage, which is, it's actually really, it's not a very good indicator for progress. I think that this is a collective discussion. What I've seen work most from our members' feedback or the organization's feedback is national coalitions that manage to secure some sort of institutionalized practices that guarantee that civil society organizations are consulted and being involved in every part of the process. But this requires also that these national coalitions work very efficiently and effectively within their own coalition, right? So that themselves have very clear processes on how to collect their own data, so as also to validate the role when discussing with the governments. And of course, we're always talking about political environments which are at least a little bit conducive for civil society organization participation. This is not something we will be able to see in countries where there is no civic space, right? So right now, out of the top of my head, I can think of the process in Argentina, where I am from, and the process there works because democracy, it's kind of consolidated, let's say, and there is an interest from the government to incorporate CSO perspectives, because there is also an awareness from the government that the official national mechanisms are not enough for responding to all the development needs. So the role of civil society organization, it's not even, it's more than complementary, it's basic, it's needed. CSOs are on the ground providing basic services, education, healthcare, access to credit, and government needs to acknowledge that this is so, because it's evident. So I think it's my perspective is that it's a matter of working together, building strong national coalitions, and bringing in a solid voice for discussing with the government. That would be my feedback.
Great, thank you. And again, just to be clear, unfortunately, Zebis, there is no requirement for governments to involve civil society because it was negotiated in 2015 that these should be voluntary reviews. And so it's really up to each government. But I think Josefina has pointed out some very good approaches that we can all use together to keep up that pressure. And before we come to you, Nicolas, I see we also have Daisy. I recognize Daisy Omugusha, who's joined us as well. Daisy, perhaps you would like to make your question before we go to Nicolas. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Oli. As they said, I'm Daisy. I'm calling from Uganda. One of my questions, I had typed it in the question, just like on the choice of the countries, or the scorecard countries. I was hoping I would see Uganda. But that aside, I'm happy with the presentations. Thank you, the presenters. My concern is on what has been presented in terms of the progress which has been made. They are saying that at least 84% of the countries are already adopting their the SDGs in their development plans, but still there's a low usability by CSOs. These SDGs have not significantly contributed to the challenges of the marginalized and vulnerable. The impact on the ground is low, and maybe it has just raised issues and rather than lifting the people. So that's what I could summarize. But also on the other hand, issues of CSOs are not being integrated or in the decision making, or they are not involved in decision making. So to me, it looks like that, I don't know whether that could be a cause or an explanation to see if countries are implementing, why is it that actually we are not seeing as much change as we had expected. And given that the CSOs, they are not, maybe their inputs are not included. So to me, I see it as the space in which we should maybe more concerned to work hard to make sure that the views of CSOs are included, because whatever they are doing, it's not making as much progress. Or I think I need to know maybe how we can work together to make sure that that changes. I know you have said that governments are not obliged to include CSOs, but maybe this is a point that could be something the issue should be pointed out to governments so that they can appreciate. But otherwise, thank you so much. I think that was enlightening, both of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you so much. So just to conclude this first panel, let me come back to Nicolas. Nicolas, do you have some thoughts for Daisy in terms of how we ensure implementation? And also there's a question from Laura, I think you will have seen in the chat, Laura Becerra, which highlights a question around, have the scorecards or spotlight reports enabled more dialogue with government? Can you give any examples of that? Over to you, Nicolas.
Thanks, Oli. Well, regarding Laura's question, first of all, yeah, I mean, it's mixed results. Let's say there have been improvements in the way of scorecard reports and spotlight reports, allowing more dialogue with governments, but only to a certain extent, and that extent is mainly the VNR, I would say. We have some countries, for example, in 2021, we had colleagues from civil society in Zimbabwe were able to actually get their government to include the results from the scorecard that they independently were able to develop into their VNR. in other African countries like Sierra Leone, of course. There was also in 2021 a pretty interesting experience where the government there was able to allow civil society to conduct its own consultation process that then informed the VNR, and civil society in Sierra Leone also conducted the scorecard for that. But I have to say, for now, the civil society participation tend to had this boundary of the VNR, let's say, up to now. It hasn't really permeated more broadly into the wider political system, let's say, and allowing more political participation within the political system at large, let's say. But that's not a limitation of the scorecard and the spotlight report, but of the SDGs as a whole. As I presented, there are very, very few countries where the SDGs have really allowed for either institutional innovations to allow more participation from society at large into policy making or decision making processes, or to allow actual concrete, tangible contribution from civil society on a more sectorial basis, let's say, for the SDGs, etc. So that's the thing is, the SDGs, yes, were a result of a consensus from the international community in the context of the UN, but of course, the implementation process and the national application, let's say, of the SDGs entails the interaction between this global framework and actual political systems that are very different across the board in each country, can vary over time also, so which doesn't allow for continuity of efforts sometimes. So I wouldn't say that there's a ready-made or a one-size-fits-all solution in order for civil society to try to push governments to adopt more participatory approaches. But if there one's constant, I would agree with Josefina in the sense of civil society still has to maintain its pressure, let's say, and try to use the SDGs as a mobilizing factor, and try to really show that civil society is indeed well coordinated and is able to build around the SDGs in a very strong fashion, let's say. But of course, those kind of processes actually yielding tangible results depends on the political conditions on the ground, let's say. So also from the institution, just quickly from the institutional point of view, one thing that also would be an interesting element to really try to push for is to try to really have governments try to build and open spaces for dialogue around sustainable development that can really help a society-wide building of consensus around sustainable development also. Spaces that would be detached from the usual confrontation, let's say, of usual electoral politics, let's say, and try to rise above that and try to bring society as a whole into try to build pathways around how to develop more sustainbly. That's what I would say. I don't know if it's very clear because it's a very complex subject, but to answer in 2 minutes, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, no, thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Josefina. I know that there's a lot more that we could discuss on this subject, and clearly the ways that we strengthen dialogue with civil society is really crucial to all of our work. And I think you've heard some good examples from previous years, including from Argentina, from Sierra Leone. We know there are also useful dialogues in Ghana, in Kenya, in Malaysia in previous years. So there have been some interesting examples. And this year, there are also some strong examples. And so we're very pleased to have a good mix from different parts of the world. So we'll be hearing, first of all, from Leah from Zambia. I know there's been a very active process in Zambia in terms of dialogue on the VNR. And Leah, perhaps you can talk us through your process and how you've gone about bringing different civil society voices into that process on the VNR. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Oli, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. So for Zambia, just like in many parts, I think when the VNR process started out, I would like you to move to the next slide. When the VNR process started out, okay, that's a bit about ourselves, but I'm mindful of, the time limit that we have. So, but we're a national platform for civil society, CBOs, and faith-based organizations operating in Zambia. So when we started out this process, I think it was devoid of civil society organizations participating. But now I can say that we're making steady progress. But in terms of our country context, I must mention that we're going to this high-level political forum and VNR process on the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think if people follow current affairs, you might have also noted that our president was part of the African leaders that went to see if there's a possibility of brokering peace between Russia and Ukraine. So we're still, feeling some of the impact of that war. We also have a high date, and also we've seen our country also challenged due to issues around climate change. Zambia only has one rain season, and so we're quite highly dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So I think it has also posed a bigger challenge towards the achievement of the SDGs, particularly those around poverty, as well as ending hunger. So for this particular reporting cycle, our national report is going to be reporting on goal 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, 13, 15, and 17. And unfortunately, we are sad because I think with some work that we did 2 years ago with Forus, we did highlight the cross-cutting nature of goal 16. And I think later on in my presentation, I'll allude to it. So we did hope as ZCSD that that was also one of the goals would still, see ourselves as a country reporting on. We could move. Now, I think my colleagues before me have also just spoken about the importance of the voluntary national review process. And we see this as ZCSD and wider civil society organizations that the VNR process provides a crucial opportunity to evaluate and assess the progress that we've made in the delivery of the SDGs. And looking at my three predecessors and their presentations, you can see that there's a mismatch between what our countries are reporting. I'm looking at the last VNR report for Zambia. It was highly positive. And even now, it's the one that we've seen, the draft is quite, overly positive. And so this is a mismatch with what the perception is on the ground, because the much talked about progress, for instance, is not trickling down to the ordinary Zambian. So like I alluded to earlier on, Zambian civil society organizations have been participating in the process for some time, but we've been disjointed. But this year, I think we've seen a move towards a little bit more collaboration, because I think later on I'll speak to some of the processes that will show that I think civil society this year have done a little bit better in trying to coordinate, but then also find out which other civil society organization is doing at what, and be able to input in those processes. So on our part as ZCSD, we participated in the last reporting cycle for Zambia. And if I'm not mistaken, it could have been the first one or the second one. And then we hopefully are going to participate in this process. And of course, I think it's through the global network, for instance, to Action for Sustainable Development goals, as well as our membership to Forus, that I think has enabled that participation. And then closer to home at national level, Zambia as a country for this year has been able to connect across different stakeholders to shape the VNR report for this year, 2023. And when ZCSD reached out to the Minister of Finance and National Planning, who has a responsibility of putting together the VNR report, they did mention to say, look, we receive input from CSOs, but it's often in a silo. And so they practically pointed us as to another consortium of CSOs that was led by an INGO that was reporting into the process. And they said, look, some of the things that you're highlighting and bringing out are very important. And also the other group is also bringing important issues. And so Ministry of Finance kind of like also now facilitated a process where we had to talk. And you see, because of this move towards maybe results, where you want to connect yourself to a process, you find that sometimes civil society organizations tend to work in a silo because they want to point to a process and say, no, this is as a result of our intervention. So if there are many players, you find that it's difficult. You can co-own a result, but you can't directly say, okay, we are the ones that innovated and did this. So, but through that process, it meant that ZCSD and the CSOs that we're working with, we were also put together with the other CSO-led organization to be able to participate in the process. But then also thanks to F4D as well, F4SD as well, we were connected to colleagues under JCAP Zambia umbrella that were also participating in this process. So I think this is why I'm saying for this year, I think we've sort of like increased our collaboration, which is important for government. And even as we develop a country report. We can move to the next slide. And so I think that went into this slide where we're talking about facilitating an inclusive VNR process in Zambia. So the Zambian government is new, not so new, because we're over 2 years now. But with the new government, we've sort of like sensed and seen a different approach in engaging civil society organizations. So most of the new political leaders that we have and some of the technocrats, their background is sort of like private sector and other areas. So they are willing to learn. And I think as civil society organizations, we've leveraged that appetite for them to learn on how government has been working, how it engages with civil society, to be able to sort of like deepen our engagement with the government. So I think that this process couldn't have come at a better time than now. And we've seen a more inclusive approach as a result of that change of government. So we are still trying as civil society organizations to see how we harness it. And so ZCSD alongside other civil society organizations have been given space to input into the GRZ-led VNR report. I think last reporting period, we only saw the VNR report for Zambia at the same time as everybody else was seeing it when it was being delivered at the high level political forum, because even when we had asked for it before then, we were told it wasn't ready. So this time around, we're in close communication with the person that's leading to develop the VNR report. And as at last week, for instance, we knew that there was a draft in place, and then also ZCSD and I think another CSO were also asked about the work that we've been doing and the process we've been doing. And so we're able to show some case studies that are going to be included in the GRZ VNR report. They are also producing a documentary. And again, when they realized that civil society, there were like 2 consortiums inputting into the process, again, the Minister of Finance sent it back and shared what are the documentary script that had been developed. And they said, look, this is just focusing on disability, but I think development is so wide and encompassing. So could you please ensure that you input into that process? So you can see that from the government, whatever information they are receiving, and if it's from civil society, they're able to reach out and force us to kind of like collaborate, which I think is a positive aspect. And because of that, the other consortium of CSOs were drafting a shadow report. And at the last minute, ZCSD was still able to input into that shadow report. And one of the goals, like I earlier alluded on, that wasn't being reported on was Goal 16. And we felt that in as much as the country is not reporting on Goal 16, can the civil society shadow report include reporting on Goal 16? And we did share the study that was done with Forus and the Asian Development Association back in 2020, 2021 with the consortium. And I think there's a paragraph that's been written around Goal 16, which I think is positive. Then we've also continued sensitization, because I think, as my colleagues alluded to, we like to assume that everybody knows about the SDGs, but reality on the ground, as with Mr. Mumba last week in, I think, 800 kilometers away from the capital, Lusaka, which is the northern part of the country. And most of the people that we spoke with were not aware about the SDGs. Others felt that they were elitist and they were removed from the process. So through every workshop that we're having now at the moment, ZCSD has been taking advantage to also just talk about the SDGs and how whatever we're doing is sort of like feeding into that Agenda 2030. We've also continued to send this message through media and then through meetings. And then also, we've been saying that maybe now that we're at the halfway point and only like 6 years away from the achievement of the SDGs, we really need to come up with some key messages. And I think one of the messages is, you know, how have we done? And if we're halfway through the implementation of the SDGs, and are we likely to achieve the SDGs? So this message really needs to be sent to a cross-section of stakeholders, so that I think accelerated effort needs to be put in place. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Leah, just to say, I'm afraid we're running short on time. So just 1 minute if you can, just to wrap up.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, so of course, I think earlier on, Nicholas talked about the scorecard. So we are also participating in that process. So maybe we go to the next slide in terms of like what we're looking at going into the future. So we are saying that we need to continue advocacy on meaningful participation by collecting stories of success, even failures, and engaging citizens in the VNR process. We need to also capture lessons and barriers to SDGs implementation. Some of them were highlighted, but then also we are still stressing to say we need to be able to report on Goal 16. That was supposed to be Goal 16, not Goal 17. And then also we need also just to build capacity. And I think this was also alluded to. So next slide should be the last one, I think. Yeah, so I think those are some of the things. And the final one, which is very important, I think we need to own the success if we're going to achieve the SDGs, but also we need to own the failure collectively if we're not going to achieve the SDGs. So I think we need now to move, each stakeholder must be held accountable. So government, civil society, the international community, we need to be held accountable for the achievement and implementation of the SDGs if we're going to make significant progress. The final slide, thank you very much. That's my mother tongue, Zikomo.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much. And yes, we look forward to being able to hear even more from you and your colleagues during the HLPF itself. We are really glad that you're able to do that spotlight report, and that you'll have the chance also to bring some of those points in at the HLPF. So now, if we can move on, because time is pressing, we'd love to hear from Puteri from the Cooperation Committee for Cambodia. Cambodia is also a VNR country this year. Puteri, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, because we are in different time zones. I will try to be short. Example from Cambodia. Yes, next slide, please. So we will, this is what, it's just the background, so everyone know that for the HLPF reviews, they're gonna be goal 6, 7, 9, 11, and 17 of the SDG. But for Cambodia, the government, the UN, and the civil society cooperation committee for Cambodia is kind of one of the coalition that represent on the discussion of this review with the government through Ministry of Planning. And they do more than just goals 6, 7, 9, 11, and 17. It seems like every SDG goal, but particularly they're gonna highlight these 5 goals for the HLPF, but in country context, more that all the goal has been reported and discussed. Yeah, thank you. Next, please. Yeah, just a brief background on the process back in Cambodia. It's like more on the local government officer, the stakeholder, ministry. It's like everyone from the government side and from civil society side. It's all the coalition. So this is the proposal that so far have been conducted since 2022 and then early 2023. There's many meetings on the voluntary national review process from the government side, also from civil society side. Yes. Next, please. So the stakeholder here, I refers to the method and engagement. Of course, there's also online and also on the meetings, the face-to-face meetings between the stakeholder to discuss on how we will measure those kind of implementation of the SDGs and how can they integrate into the report. So there's a lot of consultation, and I can say that it's quite challenging. I would agree with Nico that normally general public does not know that that consultation process. So we only invite the relevant, of course we invite relevant civil society who work on the thematic issue of each goal for the voluntary national review. But if you talk about general public on the SDG, I think there's still limitation on the engagement. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just an example of the structure back in country. So the input provide to the technical working group. So normally the technical working group will have the line ministry, the cooperation committee for Cambodia, and the NGO forum. They are absent now, but normally they been engaged at the local level, the Chamber of Commerce and academia. So these 4 main actors contribute to the technical working group. And in Cambodia, Ministry of Planning is the secretariat of these line ministry, civil society, private sector, and academic to collect those inputs. Yes, next. Yeah, this is what been so far we agree on, mainly all the goal, but our role in the specifically on these 5 goals, we monitor as civil society on the challenges, because there is also existing indicator that the government commit to deliver. So we do not talk about the what they have already commit, but it kind of the monitoring role in the process, how far they commit and they implement the SDG goal on the 6, 7, 9, 11, and 17 specifically. And there is also input, like a long input, 80 pages from those consultation process to the voluntary national review of the government. Yeah. Next, please. Yeah. So this is quite early stage that Ministry of Planning, they're gonna collect input from civil society by the end of February. So that is the reason civil society and especially in Cambodia, it's quicker that we end the process. The official one in January 2023. We conduct consolidation workshop to member partner, the gender group, the LGBT, like engage as many actors as possible, and it's quite very early. And we send a request to provide input at the subnational level. So it's many workshops going on from civil society at national level, at the same time subnational level. Next, yes. So after the consolidation input from civil society, the process is to bring those input. The challenge is we cannot submit directly to Ministry of Planning. You have to submit each goal to the ministry, line ministry, based on the goal, specific goal. So it takes more time. So particularly the technical working group and interministerial meeting has been conducted to ensure that there is input and everything. Then there is a road draft from the government in May 2023. I think the important is the UN agency and Ministry of Planning and also civil society representative. These three actors work together, and we got the updated information from civil society and from the UN, because UN sent technical consultant to work with Ministry of Planning to ensure that all the input collected from civil society and other stakeholders has been integrated in the report, the voluntary national review, as well as the whole SDG consolidation. So they did inform us that most of the input from civil society has been integrated in their report, but they would remove this is the input from civil society, this is the input from line ministry, but it's more on the general document of the government itself. So you will not see any civil society mentioned on the report. It's just like, this is the government and all this, but the digestion is already there. So this is how the process going at the national level. And we will join the high-level political forum as well from Cambodia, from civil society in Cambodia, but it's more on education and more different NGO will join. So the quick input is we have to meet before we go there, because they're gonna be different. The government gonna have their own statement, and from civil society, of course, they're gonna be a statement, but this is another meeting to ensure that the statement is more on constructive and how to move forward on the after the voluntary national review. Thank you.
Thank you, Puteri. Thank you so much. We understand that it's a challenge, but it sounds like you've been working together with many different key partners to bring in those voices. And absolutely, as you highlight, one of the things that we'll be working with many of you together is to ensure that there's always one stakeholder opportunity to comment on each of the VNRs when they happen in New York as well. So let's keep in touch as we get closer to the HLPF. So to conclude this second round and to give us some insights now also from the Latin American side, I'm very pleased that we have Miguel Santibanez, who's back with the Asociación Chilena de ONGs, Acción Chile. It's great to have you here, Miguel. Over to you.
Muchas gracias, Oli, y un saludo a todos y a todas, ¿no? En especial a los traductores que están haciendo un tan buen trabajo. Bueno, el caso de Chile, creo que para este año es muy importante hablar del contexto Este año en Chile se cumplen 50 años del golpe de Estado del 11 de septiembre de 1973. Por lo tanto, hay en Chile un ambiente emocional especial que reabre ciertas heridas muy profundas en la sociedad chilena y que todavía yo pienso que no se han cerrado y todavía se están procesando. Además, estamos cumpliendo casi 4 años, poco más de 3 años del estallido social del 18 de octubre de 2019, con una movilización social muy importante, inédita, que cambió el ambiente nacional, cambió la agenda y abrió un momento de discusión política que no se había dado en mucho tiempo y con mucha participación ciudadana. Y se abrió un momento, como decía, un momento de discusión constituyente, de la constitución política del Estado, ¿no? Que había sido formulada en 1980 en dictadura. Por lo tanto, eso se puso en cuestión. Producto de eso, producto del estallido social y producto de la instalación de ese debate, se elige una convención constituyente con 150 representantes. Esto se hace en el 2020, a mediados del año 2020. Una convención muy representativa, muy progresista, que tomó, digamos, todo el vuelo que traía el estallido social y con un campo popular muy bien representado dentro de esos 150 convencionales. Y esta propuesta de convención, nueva propuesta de constitución política, resultó que recogía las demandas históricas de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Sin embargo, como paradoja, esta propuesta es rechazada ampliamente el 4 de septiembre del año pasado, del año 2022, por un 62%, contra un 38% que la aprueba. Paralelamente a eso, hay elecciones presidenciales en donde gana la izquierda y centroizquierda con Gabriel Boric. El 2021, Gabriel Boric asume en marzo del 2022 y se enfrenta a un candidato que acá llamamos de ultraderecha, a José Antonio Kast. Boric gana por 56% contra un 44%. Paralelamente a eso, hay unas elecciones parlamentarias en donde la derecha y la centro-derecha obtienen una leve mayoría. Por lo tanto, hay una mayoría parlamentaria que era contraria a los cambios propuestos, digamos, por la convención constituyente anterior. Finalmente, producto del rechazo de la propuesta constitucional, el mundo político institucional propone un nuevo camino para avanzar en el cambio constitucional y propone un consejo constitucional durante el año actual, durante el 2023, en el cual se elige un consejo constituyente de 50 miembros. Esto se elige el 7 de mayo del 2023, en donde la ultraderecha obtiene el 40% de los votos, perdón, el 40% de los representantes, obtiene 22 representantes de 50, la ultraderecha. La derecha tradicional obtiene 11 representantes y la izquierda y centroizquierda obtiene 17 representantes de 50. Por lo tanto, y eso está en proceso. Ellos tienen que emitir una propuesta de nueva constitución en octubre, noviembre de este año, y esta se plebiscitará en en diciembre. Entonces, estos procesos de convención han sido con mucha participación social, con propuestas de artículos, con audiencias ciudadanas, y bueno, y esto ha generado que actualmente exista una especie de agotamiento, de exceso de elecciones, exceso de consultas, y ya es difícil movilizar a la ciudadanía, ya incluso a este proceso constituyente. Entonces, eso es importante de plantear, digamos, como el ambiente. Entonces, el ambiente, hay un ambiente, yo diría, un poco depresivo respecto de las posibilidades de futuro de los planteamientos que hace la sociedad civil. La sociedad civil ha tenido una larga trayectoria de acompañamiento de los procesos internacionales, de los objetivos de desarrollo del milenio, del proceso del 2015 y posteriormente de los informes nacionales voluntarios que se han hecho en el caso de Chile el 2017 y el 2019. Hemos realizado informes Luz, y estamos, digamos, en ese proceso. Por otra parte, el gobierno ha generado un mecanismo, un consejo consultivo participativo, y este año ha hecho una cantidad de consultas a lo largo del país, pero que no ha alcanzado a más de 280 organizaciones en todo el país. Además, ha generado un mecanismo de consulta en línea, por internet. Bueno, en ese marco, la sociedad civil, particularmente la organización que yo represento, la Asociación Chilena de ONGs, está impulsando un proceso de articulación con el campo social, sindical, de consumidores, de organizaciones sociales, de la filantropía, de ONGs, de cooperativas, para intentar articular y formular un informe Luz lo más representativo que se pueda, en términos de mostrar tanto las demandas de la sociedad civil en este contexto, como el ambiente, digamos, que estamos viviendo, articulado con las tensiones del debate político y constitucional. En eso estamos, digamos, y esperamos seguir avanzando y mantenerlos informados. Eso. Gracias.
Gracias, Miguel. Sí, es una situación muy difícil. I think it's very clear from the presentation that Miguel has just given some of the underlying tensions that make it very difficult to really truly address the Sustainable Development Goals, and what a challenging context we see in so many countries politically. I think it's worth noting, for example, that the United States has not even done one VNR yet, given some of the recent, the previous presidency there as well. So it's a challenging context, but that's why we need to work together as civil society, and that's why we have the opportunity here to support each other and to learn from each other. And I think it's been a very, very rich and important discussion today. We are running out of time, but before we close, I wanted just to highlight a couple of points that are coming up around the HLPF itself. For those of you who will be attending the HLPF, you can now find online the registration. So if you haven't yet registered, please do so as soon as possible. I believe the registration is open until this Friday, so only a couple more days to go. And the overall agenda of the HLPF is available online. And we know that I'll just put it in the chat here. We know that most of the VNRs will start on the Friday and then will continue throughout the second week until the Wednesday. So from the Friday, the 14th through till the Wednesday, the 19th, there will be a series of different VNRs. Maybe I can share my screen. We have now received a list. Well, actually, what I can do is I'll just share my screen very briefly for those who are interested. There will also be some further information coming soon. Side events have just been announced as well. And so for those who are there, you'll be able to join the side events also. And many of those happen inside the UN again this time in person. And there'll also be a number of side events happening online. So as the NGO major group will be collecting the list. So this is where you find the program of the HLPF, and you can scroll down and pick day by day. So this is the Friday when the VNRs start, and then you'll see the Monday and on into the Wednesday the 19th. The side events, yes, they're not yet published on the website, but they will be coming out very soon. And we, as I say, as the NGO major group, there will be a list of key side events that we know about that are being organized by different partners, both inside the UN and online, and also in some cases outside as well. And one last thing to bear in mind, if you are coming to New York, there'll be civil society weekend workshops again, as we used to do before the pandemic. So that will take place over the weekend of the 15th and 16th. So the Saturday, the 15th of July, we aim to have a weekend workshop in the church center. And on the Saturday, we'll be looking at the VNRs in more detail. So we will have a few hours there in person to actually discuss learnings from different VNR countries, from those of you who are coming, those of you who can share your own experience of organizing these VNR dialogues. And on the Sunday, the 16th, we'll spend some time together looking ahead to the SDG Summit in September, because we know this year we have also the SDG Summit at the General Assembly level. And the idea is that the SDG Summit, which then takes place on the 18th and 19th of September, will be the moment when the heads of state and government highlight their commitments and their hopefully additional pledges on how they will achieve the SDGs by 2030. So that will be a key moment in September, and we look forward to campaigning with many of you to raise awareness and to put pressure on your governments to then come to the summit in September with some very tangible and clear proposals on what they will do next. So it's a busy year, and we know that many of you are already active in your countries. Please do keep in touch to let us know if there's anything else we can do to support you. If you are still looking to register for the HLPF, please feel free to reach out to us as well. Please let me know. I'll put my email here in the chat as well, because I also serve as one of the organizing partners of the NGO major group, so I can help in terms of registration. So I think that covers everything at this point. So once again, on behalf of all the organizers, Forus, CPDE, and Action for Sustainable Development, thank you again for joining us today. We hope you've been able to gather some useful inputs for your work, and we really look forward to continuing to work with you both in July at the HLPF and again in September at the SDG Summit on the 18th and 19th of September. And before we close, the colleagues from Forus have reminded me, well, thanks to Forus, there's a short survey which we'd appreciate if you have time to fill this in. This gives you a chance to give us any feedback on the webinar today, also to continue to raise questions with us. So please do either scan the QR code that's on the screen now, or follow the link that's just been put in the chat by Stefania from Forus. So please make sure to fill that in, and we look forward to seeing you again at future joint webinars. We'll no doubt have a follow-up webinar after the HLPF and before the SDG Summit to help to join the dots as we plan ahead for the rest of the year. So thank you again to everyone, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Merci, gracias, bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye, Oli and everyone.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Take care. Bye.
Gracias. Chao.
Bye, muchas gracias.